Well, it turned out that newer RockShox forks aren't symmetric anymore. Not only is the damper side stanchion much thicker, but it no longer has a groove for the snap ring, something I need for both my air spring and damper design. On top of that, the CSU is 16mm longer, which would bump up the axle to crown height far beyond what I want. So, I sold the new fork and got myself a new used CSU off Bikemarkt. Now that the fork is finally back together, we can continue to discuss the faults of air springs. But instead of giving you another full-blown thermodynamics lecture, I figured I'd just show you what I mean this time. Hope you're in for some budget science, cause Mom said we have telemetry at home. If you managed to endure the last video where we covered how your air spring works, then that will really pay off now. The sharp-minded among you may have noticed that the last time we only talked about compression, but at some point your fork also has to extend. The same thermodynamic principles apply to rebound too, only in reverse. That's why the rebound path tends to be a bit shallower and the spring makes these loops on every compression cycle. But to find out how big of a role these effects actually play in the real world, I decided to dabble in some basic data acquisition and measure what my fork is really doing on a proper downhill track. Before getting into the test, I should mention my fork setup. I run medium compression and open rebound with 170mm of travel, but an extra 10mm are actually sucked into the fork, giving me a bit of negative travel. That extra 10mm travel smooths things out and makes the fork track really well. Not sure how common this setup is, but I'm very happy with it. I found this gives the best ride feel on my bike. Running full 180mm with 20% sag raised the front end too much. And I didn't want to increase the sag and sacrifice that sweet mid-stroke support I get from the more linear setup. I taped colored strips to the fork crown and the lowers and fixed my GoPro to the frame, aimed directly at the fork, so I can record a full run of the Crankworx Innsbruck downhill track in slow motion. That track is fast, rough, and has everything we need to test the performance of this fork. Afterwards, I will use OpenCV to track the strips with an algorithm and measure the distance between them in each frame. Here's a short preview of the course. So I made the grave error of recording the slow motion first, because I didn't want the sun to come out and ruin the shots again. But now I don't think I've got one of those runs left in me again, because the last one was fast. So we'll just do a nice chill preview of the course, see what it's about. So this is always a little rough. Really gotta push the fork down into these compressions to get grip. Inside. Over the roots and into this horrible section. Whew. That's one of the hardest compressions on the trail, and I almost always use full travel on that one. Whee! And now this one. To the step down. Alright. Stay outside, get in between these two roots, and try not to hit that tree. Whoa. You could get this, but that went wrong before.
these two in between. Up and down, and down again. Hard braking. Middle line, outside, carry speed, and lesser down. Wow, definitely feeling that. But no weird sounds from the fork, which is great. This right here, just roll down and pray. And now to the fast speed. Now to the high speed section. Okay. A little bit of braking. To the right. And inside. Okay. And now the last section. This jump a couple of days ago and landed way too deep, so I am never gonna do that again. That is the weirdest corner on the entire trail. Send it down here and drop. Whew. And that's the Innsbruck Crackworks downhill. Whew. Damn. Pretty awesome trail.
My first test run didn't exactly go as planned. At 120 frames per second, the data point resolution was not the best for super fast hits, and I had the digital image stabilization enabled, which made the strips wander around in the frame and even disappear entirely at times. On top of that, I used blue strips, and every time the blue sky crept into the background, the tracker got hopelessly confused. So, for round 2, I switched to 240 FPS footage without stabilization and used neon pink strips. And this time, it worked great. To prepare the footage for tracking, we first need to turn it into a real-life version of that Mr. Incredible meme. For some reason unbeknownst to man, my GoPro won't let me record 240 FPS in linear lens mode. It's not a huge problem, since the fork stays mostly centered in the frame and doesn't get warped too much. Still, removing lens distortion helps the distance measurements, so that's the first thing we should do. It's not perfect, but the effects on this scale are negligible. After all, we're trying to use the data to identify general trends, not to get exact values. To make tracking easier, I cranked up the saturation, sharpened the image, and isolated the pink color range. There were a few cases where a bit of color bled through from the frame and the rim decals, so I zoomed in to focus mostly on the fork and added a desaturation mask to the edges. With everything prepped, I ran the Python script and let the tracker algorithm do its thing. What you are seeing here is a full run of the downhill track. The graph shows the measured distance in pixels over time. At the start, you can see me sitting on my bike trying to pick a song on my music player for a really long time. So this isn't even at sag. But overall, the measurements were spot on, up until halfway down the track, when a little mud splash hit the camera. That caused the tracker to get a little confused at times. I tried using smoothing algorithms to fix the bad data points, but they either didn't catch every mishap or smoothed out too much detail. In the end, I decided to use the pattern seeker in my head and manually drag the points back into place. Took me about 20 minutes, so that wasn't too bad. Now with the cleaned up data, we can convert pixel distance into actual fork travel, which lands us a graph of position versus time. That's great, but I additionally need to calculate the shaft velocity during the run. Velocity is the first time derivative of position, which basically means it's just the slope of this curve. The most basic way to get values is to connect the points and use the slope between them as an approximation for the velocity. Using the next slope for a point is called forward difference, and using the previous slope is called backward difference. But both are pretty inaccurate. A better method is where you take the difference between the previous and the next dots and assign the slope to the middle point. It's an improvement, but still not great when your data has big jumps in it or has too much noise. A much better approach is to fit a smooth curve through the data and then differentiate that. From this, we get a much more accurate value for the velocity at each point. Looking at the velocity data, we see a pattern that's very typical for suspension. Peak compression velocity is usually hit around the first third of the travel, while peak rebound happens close to about 75%. The highest speeds occur during one big hit, where I managed to bottom out the fork. But most importantly, you can see that the velocity varies a lot, especially in the middle part of the travel. And from what we talked about last time, that means that the airspring is constantly shifting in behavior due to its sensitivity to compression speed. To show these effects, I plugged in the real-world position, time and velocity data into the airspring simulation from the last video. Oh, but this time, I beefed up the heat loss model by a lot. Last time, I used an implicit model for estimation because an explicit one would have too many unknown factors. This time, it's a hybrid model that's way more sophisticated, but still bound to physical expectations. It accounts for heat loss based on exposure time, contact area, and temperature gradient. It also models heat buildup from the friction of the seals and the bushings, and the spring force reacts to seal softening and other dynamic friction effects. The heat transfer coefficient adjusts based on collision rates from pressure changes and even includes small amounts of forced convection from the motion of the piston. Luckily, all this was super easy to implement and didn't cost me a large amount of my free time. Anyway, this is what the simulation gets us. So, there is a lot to unpack here. We can see the force versus travel graph, but now the force at a certain travel point varies because of thermal effects. You can also kind of see the characteristic loops we were talking about earlier, like here, where I bottomed out my fork. Other than that, I actually barely got past 140 millimeters of compression on the whole run. I mentioned that the spring I invented was linear, which is true for slow and single-instance compressions. But when you factor in heat buildup, the spring actually gains some progression, which I still desire from my setup. A perfectly linear spring would mean even less travel used in general, and the spring might be too stiff in the beginning parts of the travel. The heat map shows where the fork spent most of its time in the travel. If you added ride data from other tracks, you'd basically get a statistical distribution of the... Yeah, I guess there really isn't a translation for that one. It's the probability of the fork being at a certain point in the travel at a random moment in time. This means the middle area is where your fork lives, and everything else is just trips to the gym or grocery shopping. We can refer to this area as the dynamic sag, but keep in mind that this area shifts upward on steeper trails and downward on flatter ones, depending on weight distribution. And that brings us to the real challenge. What most riders are looking for is a certain amount of support to resist hits and control how the suspension moves through the travel. You tune suspension for ride feel, and the stiffness is what you actually feel when riding. Support and stiffness are the same thing, which is the slope of this spring curve. So you might want to set the stiffness of your spring so that it feels just right during the part of the travel where you spend the most of the time riding, which you absolutely should, by the way. We can use the data we acquired and adjust the model to simulate a more typical airspring. Technically, this isn't 100% legit, because a different spring would produce different data. But, it's good enough for the point I'm trying to make. If we adjust the pressure so that both springs use the same maximum travel, the typical spring ends up with significantly lower mid-stroke stiffness. You can aim to match the stiffness of both springs in the middle, but then the setup with the conventional airspring only uses about 150 millimeters of travel. So what's the point of having a 170 millimeter fork at all? See? That's the fundamental compromise with most airspring designs. Balancing full travel usage and mid-stroke support is tricky, and that's exactly what I'm trying to fix. So yeah, that's where I'm at. This little DIY telemetry setup actually gave me real insight into how my fork behaves on a proper trail. Anyway, that's it for now. Next time, we might crank the nerd dial even higher. Or just go ride bikes. Well, probably both.
Aruba, Jamaica, ooh, I wanna take ya. Bermuda, Bahama, come on, pretty mama. Key Largo, Montego, baby, why don't we go? Jamaica, off the Florida Keys. There's a place called Kokomo. That's where you wanna go to get away from it all. Bodies in the sand, tropical drink melting in your hand. We'll be falling in love to the rhythm of a steel drum band. Down in Kokomo, Aruba, Jamaica, ooh, I wanna take you to Bermuda, Bahama, come on, pretty mama. Key Largo, Montego, baby, why don't we go down to Kokomo? We'll get there fast and then we'll take it slow. That's where we wanna go. Way down to Kokomo. Martinique, that Montserrat mystique. We'll put out to sea and we'll perfect our chemistry. By and by we'll defy a little bit of gravity. Afternoon delight, cocktails and moonlit nights. That dreamy look in your eye gave me a tropical contact high. Way down in Kokomo, Aruba, Jamaica, ooh, I wanna take you to Bermuda, Bahama, come on, pretty mama. Key Largo, Montego, baby, why don't we go down to Kokomo? We'll get there fast and then we'll take it slow. That's where we wanna go. Way down to Kokomo. Port-au-Prince, I wanna catch a glimpse